Yesterday, I looked my 14-year-old brother in the eye and told him straight out that he's going into the foster care system because I officially refuse to take legal guardianship. I honestly don't care that my entire extended family is calling me a heartless monster and an egoist. Right now, I'm sitting in my new apartment in Seattle. I just made the first major down payment on it, staring at the empty walls and trying to process how my life turned into this absolute nightmare over the last 14 days. It all started exactly 2 weeks ago. I got a call from the Ohio police telling me my parents were killed in a car crash. They hit a semi-truck on a slippery highway. At that exact moment, I had just finished a high-stakes presentation for my investors. I've spent the last 3 years working without a single day off, living on instant noodles and saving every cent just to escape the poverty I grew up in. I'm the only one in my family who managed to get an education and leave that godforsaken town where the only thing to do was hang out at the local diner. My younger brother, Leo, stayed behind with our parents. To be honest, we barely spoke. Maybe twice a month, just exchanging generic texts. When I flew back for the funeral, I expected grief. Instead, I found a group of relatives already divvying up the few things my parents left behind. They had zero savings, just an old house with a massive mortgage and a stack of unpaid bills. During the wake, my Aunt Sarah, who hasn't spoken to me in 5 years, approached me with a glass of cheap wine. She told me that since I'm so successful in the big city, taking Leo in was my direct responsibility. She claimed she couldn't do it because she already had 3 kids and a bad back. I felt a cold rage bubbling up inside me. Nobody even asked if I had the capacity, the space, or even the desire to blow up my life for a kid I barely know anymore. Leo sat in the corner of the living room, hunched over, staring at a single spot on the floor. He looked lost, but I could see the same silent demand in his eyes that I saw in everyone else's. They all thought my success was public property, and that I was obligated to sacrifice it for a family debt I never signed up for. My Uncle Jim, who hasn't held a steady job in his life, patted me on the back and talked about how family is everything, clearly implying I should pay off our parents' debts and bring Leo into my new life. To them, I wasn't a person. I was just a walking wallet meant to solve a problem that had become a burden to them. I tried to explain that I work 14 hours a day, that my apartment is a studio with barely enough room for one person, and that I'm not ready to be a parent at 32. They didn't listen. The lawyer handling the estate pulled me aside and told me that if I didn't sign the papers within 10 days, social services would begin the process of moving Leo to a state facility. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the old, creaky nursery, thinking about how I built my life brick by brick to get away from this gray hopelessness. And now a single accident was trying to drag me back down. Leo came into the room late at night and asked when we were leaving for Seattle. He had already started packing his stuff into an old backpack. I physically felt the weight of a responsibility I never chose. I stayed silent, and that silence was the heaviest moment of the day. I watched his hope turn into suspicion, and then into resentment. I knew right then that no matter what I did, I was going to be the villain in this story. By the 3rd day after the funeral, the atmosphere in that house had become so thick with unspoken expectations that I could barely breathe. I spent most of my time in the kitchen, sitting at the same laminate table where I used to do my homework by candlelight because my parents couldn't pay the electric bill. Nothing had changed. The same stains were on the floor, the same smell of dampness and old grease hung in the air. But now, instead of my parents arguing about money, I had Aunt Sarah and Uncle Jim hovering over me like vultures. They didn't even wait for the flowers on the graves to wilt before they started bringing me solutions for Leo. Sarah came over on Tuesday morning with a folder. She didn't ask how I was sleeping or if I was okay after losing both parents in a single night. She just sat down, pushed a plate of stale donuts toward me, and started talking about the house. She had found out that the mortgage was 3 months behind and that the bank was already starting the foreclosure process. She told me that if I just liquidated my savings or took out a small loan, I could save the house for Leo. I looked at her and realized she didn't see me as a grieving son. She saw me as a financial insurance policy. When I told her that I didn't have $50,000 just sitting around and that my new apartment in Seattle took every bit of credit I had, her face shifted. She didn't look sorry. She looked disgusted. She told me that I had become cold, and that the city had changed me. She said I was forgetting where I came from. The truth is, I spent 10 years trying to forget exactly where I came from. I remember being 12 and having to explain to Leo why we were eating plain white rice for the fourth night in a row. I remember my father's business ideas that always ended with us losing more money and my mother crying in the bathroom so we wouldn't hear. I worked 3 jobs while going to college just so I wouldn't end up like them. And now, standing in that kitchen, I realized that my family didn't respect my hard work. They resented it. They felt entitled to the results of it. Leo's behavior started to change, too. At first, he was just quiet, but by the middle of the week, he became aggressive. I tried to talk to him about his school records and what he wanted to do, but he would just blast music in his room or leave the house for hours without telling me where he was going. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, systematically smashing my father's old work tools with a hammer. He wasn't crying. He just had this look of pure, concentrated rage. When he saw me, he didn't stop. He just said, "It doesn't matter anyway, right? You're just going to leave like you always do." That hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't let it show. I'm 32, and I've learned that if you let people see your guilt, they will use it to dismantle you. I told him to clean up the mess and went back inside. Later that night, I went through my parents' desk. I was looking for insurance papers, but instead, I found a stack of letters addressed to me that were never sent. They were from my mother, written over the last year. I thought they would be full of love, but they were mostly lists of things they needed money for. They had been planning to ask me for a loan to start another one of my father's failed projects. They hadn't called me because they loved me. They had been waiting for the right moment to guilt-trip me into being their personal bank. The realization that even my dead parents saw me as a resource rather than a son made the walls of that house feel like they were closing in. I felt zero connection to the objects around me. I felt zero connection to the people outside that door. The only thing I felt was a desperate need to protect the life I had built for myself in Seattle. My boss called me that night and reminded me that my leave ended in 10 days. If I wasn't back to lead the new project, the promotion I had been promised would go to someone else. That promotion was the difference between finally being stable and being one bad month away from debt. I sat on the edge of the bed in my old room, looking at the backpack Leo had packed. He had put a picture of us from 10 years ago on top of his clothes. He was 5 and I was holding him at a carnival. He looked at me like I was a hero. Now, when I looked at him, all I saw was a chain that would drag me back into the water I had spent my whole life trying to swim out of. My phone kept buzzing with texts from cousins I hadn't seen in a decade, all of them saying the same thing. Do the right thing. Don't let your brother down. Don't be that guy. They didn't know about the debt. They didn't know that my parents had tried to take out a credit card in my name 2 years ago. Something I had only found out when my credit score took a sudden dip and I had to spend months fighting it. I had kept that a secret to protect Leo from knowing who our parents really were. But sitting there, I wondered why I was protecting anyone. By the end of the first week, I wasn't just tired. I was done. I realized that if I stayed here one more month, I wouldn't have a life to go back to. The social worker, a woman named Mrs. Gable, looked at me over the rim of her glasses like I was a criminal when I told her I wasn't signing the guardianship papers that morning. We were sitting in the cramped, dusty living room of my parents' house. The air was stale, and the atmosphere was so heavy it felt like physical pressure on my chest. My Aunt Sarah and Uncle Jim were there too, standing by the doorway like sentinels, waiting for me to fulfill what they considered my blood duty. Mrs. Gable asked me one more time if I understood the consequences of my decision. She said that if I didn't sign, Leo would be placed in a temporary shelter by the end of the week because no one else in the family met the state's financial requirements for fostering. I looked at Sarah. She had a house with 4 bedrooms. I knew she had the space, but she didn't want the hassle of a teenager who was already showing signs of being troubled. She wanted me to pay for it all from Seattle while she sat back and judged me from a distance. I told them no. I said it clearly without stuttering. I told them I had just started a new life, that I was working 80 hours a week to keep my head above water, and that I wasn't equipped to raise a 14-year-old boy who needed therapy and constant supervision. The explosion was immediate. Sarah started screaming that I was an ungrateful child, that my parents had sacrificed everything for me, and that I was spitting on their graves. Jim stepped forward, his face turning a dark shade of red, and told me I was a cold-hearted coward who had forgotten the meaning of family. They didn't care about my career. They didn't care about my mental health. They only cared that the problem of Leo was now potentially their problem if I didn't step up. The worst part wasn't the yelling, though. It was the fact that Leo was standing at the top of the stairs, listening to every single word. I saw his shadow on the carpet before I saw him. When he finally walked down, he didn't look sad anymore. He looked like he wanted to kill me. He walked right up to me, ignored the adults, and asked me if I was really going to let them take him to a group home. I tried to explain. I tried to tell him that I couldn't give him the life he deserved right now, that I was drowning in my own responsibilities, but he didn't want to hear logic. He told me I was just like our father, always looking for a way out, always looking for a shortcut to a better life, even if it meant leaving people behind. He called me a traitor and told me he never wanted to see my face again. Then he walked out the front door and slammed it so hard the glass in the frame rattled. For the next 3 days, my phone didn't stop buzzing for a single second. My cousins, my parents' old friends from the diner, even people I hadn't spoken to since high school were sending me messages on Facebook and texting my personal number. They were all saying the same thing. How can you do this to your own flesh and blood? You're a disgrace. Money has ruined you. It was a coordinated campaign of guilt. I found out later that Sarah had been posting about the situation online, painting herself as the grieving aunt, trying to save a poor orphan from his millionaire brother. I'm not a millionaire. I have a decent salary and a mountain of debt from my education and my new apartment. But in this town, if you have a suit and a job in a skyscraper, you're basically a villain if you don't pay everyone's bills. The tension reached a breaking point on Friday night. I was at the house, trying to pack up the last of my parents' belongings so the bank could take the property, when Jim showed up unannounced. He was drunk and looking for a fight. He started going through the boxes, claiming that certain items belonged to him because he had lent my father money back in 2012. We got into a shouting match in the middle of the driveway. He told me that everyone in town knew I was a selfish prick, and that if I ever showed my face there again, I wouldn't like the welcome I'd get. He even threatened to call my employer in Seattle and tell them what kind of person I really was. I realized then that there was no family left here. There was only a group of people who felt entitled to my life because they hadn't done anything with their own. I spent that night locked in my childhood bedroom, listening to the wind hit the siding of the house. I felt like I was in a prison. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Leo's face when he called me a traitor. I felt the guilt, but I also felt a terrifying sense of clarity. If I took him, I would lose my job. If I lost my job, I would lose the apartment. We would both end up back in this town, living in a trailer, hating each other for the rest of our lives. I was choosing my survival over his stability, and the weight of that choice was making it hard to breathe. By Saturday morning, the social worker called again. Leo hadn't come home the night before. He was missing, and the police were involved. My aunt called me 5 minutes later, hysterical, screaming that if anything happened to him, his blood would be on my hands because I had abandoned him first. I sat on the floor of the empty living room and realized that the month wasn't even over, and I had already lost everything I was trying to protect. The police found Leo 48 hours after he vanished. He wasn't in another city, and he hadn't run away to some friend's house. They found him sitting in the back of my parents' rusted-out SUV in a junkyard 3 miles from the house. He was just sitting there in the dark, clutching a small metal lockbox that I had never seen before. When the officer called me to come pick him up, his voice was flat. He told me that Leo wouldn't speak to the social worker and that he was only holding on to that box like his life depended on it. I drove down there at 3 a.m., my head spinning from lack of sleep and the sheer weight of the hateful voicemails Aunt Sarah had been leaving me all night. When I got to the station, Leo looked different. The rage was gone, replaced by a kind of hollowed-out exhaustion that made him look 10 years older. He didn't look at me when I sat down across from him in the waiting room. He just pushed the lockbox across the table. He told me he found it hidden in the insulation in the attic the day after the funeral, and he had been trying to decide whether to burn it or show it to me. I opened it, expecting to find old photos or maybe some hidden cash that could solve our problems. Instead, I found a stack of legal documents and bank statements from 5 years ago, the exact time I was launching my company in Seattle. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read through the papers. I had always told everyone, and I had convinced myself that I built my career on my own. I thought I had survived those early years on grit and talent. But the documents in that box told a different story. My parents had taken out a second mortgage on the house and 3 high-interest personal loans to funnel nearly $80,000 into an anonymous business account that was used to pay my initial overhead costs when I was about to go bankrupt. They had done it through a shell company my father's old drinking buddy had set up so I wouldn't know where the money came from. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the dates. They had stopped paying the mortgage on the family home the same month they sent me the final investment check. They had literally traded the roof over their heads and Leo's future security to make sure I didn't fail. All those years I was judging them for being poor and unsuccessful. They were drowning because they were secretly subsidizing my success. And Leo knew. He had found a letter from my mother to my father at the bottom of the box, dated last month. She wrote that they were finally going to tell me the truth because the bank was taking the house, and they had no choice but to ask for help. They were on their way to a notary to sign a document that would have legally linked my business assets to their debts. A last-ditch effort to save themselves, on the night they crashed. Leo finally looked at me, and his voice was a whisper. He told me that he had overheard them talking about it for years. He knew that every time I came home and bragged about my new car or my apartment, I was doing it with money that was supposed to be his college fund, his stability, his life. He hadn't wanted to go to Seattle because he missed me. He wanted to go because he felt I owed him a life. He told me that if I sent him to foster care, he would take those papers to the press and to my investors. He would show them that the self-made tech entrepreneur was actually a fraud who let his parents die in debt while he lived the high life on their stolen credit. The moral dilemma hit me like a physical blow. If I take him in now, it's not out of love. It's out of hush money. I'd be bringing a kid into my home who fundamentally hates me, who sees me as a thief, and who has enough evidence to destroy the one thing I value most, my reputation. But if I don't take him, he's going to burn my world down. I looked at the papers, then at the brother I barely recognized. The family I thought was leeching off me was actually the family I had already bled dry without even knowing it. I checked my watch. It was almost 5 a.m. In 4 hours, I was supposed to be on a flight back to Seattle to sign the contract for my biggest project yet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my boss. Everything ready for the 10 a.m. meeting? This is the one that changes everything for us. I looked at Leo, who was waiting for an answer. I realized that the new life I was so desperate to protect was built on a foundation of lies and my brother's misery. I had to decide right there in that police station. Do I save my career and risk the scandal? Or do I take the chain around my neck and live with my victim for the next 4 years? I didn't take that 10 a.m. flight to Seattle. I called my boss from the police station parking lot and told him there was a family emergency that couldn't wait. He was furious, yelling about missed opportunities and professionalism. But I hung up on him. I went back inside, signed the papers, and officially became Leo's legal guardian. I didn't do it because I suddenly felt a wave of brotherly love. I did it because the truth in that lockbox was a nuclear bomb. If the story of my self-made success got out, if people knew I had built my company on the ruins of my parents' life and my brother's future, I would be radioactive. My reputation, the only thing I truly valued, would be incinerated. The drive to Seattle took 3 days, and it was the longest 72 hours of my life. We moved in total silence. Every time I looked at Leo in the passenger seat, I didn't see a kid who needed a home. I saw the price tag of my freedom. He didn't look at the scenery. He didn't play games on his phone. He just stared at the road ahead with a cold, terrifying maturity that made me realize the child I thought I knew was gone. When we finally pulled up to my glass and steel apartment building in downtown Seattle, he didn't look impressed. He looked around the lobby, at the concierge who greeted me by name, at the high-speed elevator, and he just smirked. It was a look that said, So this is what my college fund bought you. The first week was a disaster. My studio apartment, which I had been so proud of, felt like a cage. I had to buy a folding bed for Leo and cram it into the corner of the main room. There was no privacy. I would wake up at 4 a.m. to work, and he would be lying there, eyes wide open, watching me. He wasn't a troubled teen anymore. Il became a silent judge. I tried to buy his silence with things. I bought him the newest laptop, high-end headphones, and clothes that cost more than my first car. He took it all without a single thank you. He knew it wasn't a gift. It was interest on a loan I could never fully repay. The moral dilemma I faced in that police station hadn't gone away. It had just changed shape. I saved my career. My investors never found out. The big project went through and my bank account grew. But every time I looked at a profit statement, I saw the unpaid mortgage on that house in Ohio. I saw the face of my mother, who died knowing she had nothing left because she gave it all to a son who didn't even bother to check where the money came from. I realized I wasn't the self-made man I had told everyone I was. I was just the beneficiary of a sacrifice I was too arrogant to notice. By the end of the month, the calls from Aunt Sarah and Uncle Jim finally stopped. I sent them a formal letter through a lawyer telling them to stay away, and I think they realized that the well had finally run dry. But the victory felt hollow. One night, Leo finally spoke. He asked me if I was going to keep pretending, or if I was ever going to admit what happened. I stood there in my expensive kitchen, looking at the city lights, and I finally told him the truth. I told him he was right. I told him that everything I had belonged to him as much as it did to me. I told him I was a fraud. He didn't hug me. He didn't forgive me. He just nodded, put on his headphones, and went back to his laptop. We aren't a family. We are two people locked in a business arrangement. I am no longer the rising star of my firm because I leave at 5 p.m. to make sure there's food on the table for a teenager who barely speaks to me. My boss thinks I've lost my edge. My colleagues think I've gone soft. But the reality is much darker. I'm not being a good brother. I'm doing penance. I spend every day trying to manage a teenager who knows my darkest secret and who reminds me, with every silent stare, that my success is a debt I will be paying for the rest of my life. The month is over. The house in Ohio is gone. My parents are gone. My old self is gone. All that is left is this transaction we call a life. I have everything I ever wanted, the career, the money, the city life, but I've never felt more like a prisoner. I realized that money doesn't just buy comfort. It buys the ability to hide who you really are. But once someone sees through the glass, you can never go back to being the person you thought you were. I look at Leo, and I don't see a brother. I see a mirror, and I hate what I see. Success has a cost. Usually, it's the people who love you who end up paying the bill. I'm just the one who has to live with the receipt.